Hello, greetings and salutations. Welcome to the Historical Boxing Society podcast. Today we have one of the Australian fighters known as Dan Creedon. He is number 41 on this countdown. Dan Creedon was a middleweight. He stood 5'8", weighed about 160 pounds in his prime. He made his debut in the year 1890. Actually, he made his debut in 1889, but 1890 was his first significant fight. The Australian class of 1890 includes Jim Barron, Tut Ryan, and Dan Creedon. Those were the guys coming up with him, and Dan Creedon, of course, had a 30-round draw with one Tut Ryan in Australia. As you can see by the pictures here, Dan Creedon was a rather big, bulky middleweight, being only 5'8". His stature is very muscular. That's what he was known for through the beginning of his career, was the muscle and the power. Ironically, this is the very thing that kind of began to cost him as time went along. And I guess according to Dan Creedon's own memoirs, he started drinking and really got a loss of muscle tone in his body. And periodically throughout his career, he was referred to as no longer having a steam on his punches. So we took what was one of the best tributes of Dan Creedon, and it turned into eventually one of his most critical weaknesses. Very unusual for a fighter. His Creedon's body just seemed to deteriorate over the course of time. Now, the pros for Dan Creedon, of course, would be that he started the whole beginning run of his career as an undefeated fighter. He all the big matches that they put him in front of in the beginning of his career, Dan Creedon was successful in. As a matter of fact, he even gave some of the fighters a rematch, such as the case with Buffalo Costello, who he gave a rematch to after a super successful first win. And when he came over to America, Dan Creedon, again, in the first beginning of his American invasion, had a lot of success too. So that would be some of the pros, the fact that he rarely lost until he got into big money bouts. His first loss was to Bob Fitzsimmons, which, of course, many of the fighters lost to, as Creedon stood only 5'8", and he had a very difficult time trying to box these fighters that were much taller than him. And any of the cases where he's fighting boxers such as the size of Fitzsimmons, he tended to struggle with that reach disadvantage is what was costing him. And, of course, the cons against Dan Creedon would be that the biggest con, I guess, would be the fact that he went 0 for 8 on level ups. That's a bit unusual, as most fighters at least are getting themselves some type of a draw during a level up. But Dan Creedon had no success trying to beat the better fighters ahead of him throughout his career. As I stated, many of the matches he just kind of started deteriorating rather rapidly. So we're going to go through Dan Creedon's profile now. Dan Creedon is number 41 on this countdown. First, we're going to start with his bio. Dan Creedon won the middleweight championship crown. So he was a middleweight champion in the year 1895 with a win over Frank Craig. Now, this was an international bout, as Craig was from England, and at that time, Creedon was coming from America even though he's an Australian fighter. Technically, he's born in New Zealand, but he moved to Australia when he's 8 years old. So let's just consider him an Australian fighter. So this was an international bout for the middleweight crown, and Dan Creedon won that bout. And he made 4 successful defenses until the huge multi-$1,000 gate of a Kid Mccoy bout, which was a $10K bout, $10,000. Very, very large match. In fact, it was previous to the McCoy bout, they had full-page articles advertising the match, which was rather unique. You don't usually have the entire front page, but such was the case with Dan Creedon versus Kid Mccoy. Next, we have Dan Creedon's fighting style. Dan Creedon was more scientific than a slugger, but not at a quite professor level. He was very good at defense. He was very good at getting punches to be avoided. And he had lots of power, as I stated. He had a considerable amount of power in his youth. His power eventually evaporated from him, but he nonetheless had that power, as you can see by his physique. He's a rather chiseled individual in his youth here. We have, for competitive rounds, this is quite a bit, 279 competitive rounds. That's a pretty high number. The fact that Creedon won a lot is going to help him a lot with my score for him is 42. That's a pretty good number. That's actually more than the fighter before him in Kid Carter. The fact that Creedon went quite a while through his career before he experienced his first loss works to that advantage of having a score of 42. Now his level ups, as I stated, 0 for 8. He fought Bob Fitzsimmons, Joe Choynski, Kid Mccoy, Joe Walcott, Kid McCoy again, Jack Root, and Marvin Hart. None of those fighters Dan Creedon was able to beat. His chief nemesis, of course, would be probably Buffalo Costello. And he faces him twice in the beginning of his career, as we had the American Buffalo Costello fighting the Australian Dan Creedon in Australia before Buffalo Costello comes to America. Then Buffalo Costello comes to America, faces Alex Greggains, as I stated in a previous video, and gets 2 long draws with him. Well, Creedon not only beat Buffalo Costello twice, but he also came to America and fought Alex Greggains and, of course, won that match. So I think pretty substantially proving that he was a more efficient fighter than Buffalo Costello. Next, we have his greatest achievement. Of course, that would probably be his win over Frank Craig in 1895. That's one of the only big money matches that Creedon won, and such being the case as Frank Craig is nothing more than a D-level fighter. He's not in the countdown. Yet this was Craig's best match of his career, the one he fought with Dan Creedon. So he at least got some competitive rounds, beating one Frank Craig, which was known as the Harlem Coffee Cooler, a black fighter. Next, we have his biggest miss. His biggest miss probably would be not getting the talked about fight with one Tommy Ryan. This was more towards the beginning of Creedon's career, and my guess would be that he probably would not beat Tommy Ryan based on the fact that he's 0 for 8 on level ups, but this would probably be his biggest miss, as this fight was talked about for at least quite a few months in the newspaper prior to Creedon fighting Bob Fitzsimmons, as Creedon was hanging around with both James Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons. They were both, or at least Bob Fitzsimmons was Australian, and Creedon was sparring a little bit with James Corbett. So right around in the time frame before Creedon faced Fitzsimmons, he's constantly mentioned with Corbett and Fitzsimmons in the same sentence as being, one of the premier middleweights. Next, we have simulation wins. Dan Creedon was semi-effective in a simulation, as he got himself ahead of quite a few fighters on the list here, up to number 41 in the rankings. We're going to give you some simulation results. He had a 15-round draw with Corbett. He also had a win against Corbett. He had a draw with George Godfrey. Of course, George Godfrey was just a couple fighters ago, so they were right on the same level. He had a win against Hugo Kelly. He also had a win over trial horse Jack Bonner. He had a split decision win over Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, and he had a TKO win over Larry Temple. He also had a win over Kid Carter. And, of course, he had a 15-round draw with Frank Slavin. So that's kind of showing you some of the high-end potential of what Creedon could possibly be capable of. And next we have the newspaper depiction of Dan Creedon. And these are sentences right out of the newspaper. Creedon is as quick as a cat to take advantage of every legitimate opening presented to him. As I stated, he was very good on defense and pretty darn quick reflexes, according to the newspapers. Now, finally, we're going to go through boxers born around Dan Creedon. So Dan Creedon is of the boxing class of 1868. So we're going to go just slightly before him and just slightly after him. These are the boxers born around Dan Creedon. 1866, Jack McAuliffe. 1866, Buffalo Costello. 1866, Joe Butler. 1866, James Corbett. 1867, Frank Childs. 1868, Dan Creedon. 1868, Joe Choynski. 1868, Jim Hall. 1869, George Levine. 1869, Peter Maher. So we're going to look at how many of these fighters Creedon faced. So he sparred with Corbett. He did fight Frank Childs. Both of the fighters born in the same year of 1868, his peers, he fought. He fought Joe Choynski and he fought Jim Hall. He did not fight any of the fighters born immediately after him, but he does face Tommy West from 1870. So as old as you may think of as Peter Maher, Dan Creedon, 1 year older. I think Creedon also faced Joe Butler also. And of course he faced Costello. So at least 50% of those people Creedon did face. So next we're going to go through his competitive rounds fought with the newspaper notes. And we are going to do that now. Okay, Dan Creedon. He stood 5'8", 160. He had incredible 16-inch biceps, which was rather large. As you can see by the pictures, he was a pretty beefy individual. His very first fight of consequence is actually not in Boxing Rec. This happens in January of 1889. He faces none other than Jem Smith, who is of renown for fighting Dick Kilrain. Second round KO of Jem Smith. The notes: Smith fell like a log and failed to rise. So there we go. We got Dan Creedon right out of the gates as a 20-year-old facing an incredibly talented fighter in Jem Smith, and he wins. So now next we have August 1890. Tut Ryan. As I stated, Ryan and Creedon were the same age. They're the same launch date. 30-round draw. Two very evenly matched men. Creedon was better on defense than offense. Both were fresh at the end of the fight. So just showing you Creedon's stamina. 30-round draw, and both were fresh at the end of the fight. That's pretty incredible. Next, we have a few months later, November 1890, Jim Hall. So this is one of these weird matches where they give Creedon the win because Jim Hall failed to knock out Creedon within 8 rounds. So there's a bit of a deceptive win there. We're going to hear the notes now. The first 4 rounds, Creedon fought well. After that, he hugged his man in the most affectionate manner, and he would not stand up and fight as Jim Hall wanted. So Creedon states that he states that he won this match from Jim Hall, which he did. He got an 8-round win, but I'm not sure that he got an actual legitimate victory over Hall in this match. At the very least, we should have got a rematch, as there's 8 rounds are pretty impossible to tell who the better fighter was there. I would say, if anything, Creedon probably lost the match, as Jim Hall is saying, stand up and fight through the last 4 rounds. So at the very least, he bled away all 4 of the last rounds. So I'm not quite sure how he would have got a legitimate win if it were just a normal fight. We have spring of the following year, May 1891, Tut Ryan number 2. So we can try and decide just exactly who is the better fighter of the two. And the results, 8-round draw. These are the notes. The referee said this is one of the best 8-round bouts he had ever seen. Creedon was bleeding badly, but dropped Ryan, who went down in round 6. Ryan recovered greatly. Creedon did most of the fighting, but Ryan had piston jabs. Ryan had all the best of the last round, forcing himself a draw in the contest. So 8-round draw sounds pretty legitimate. Certainly one of the best 8-round bouts that were seen in Australia, according to the referee. Next, we have all the way to the fall of 1891, Starlight Rowlands. There's a picture of Starlight and Dan Creedon in the older age, as Starlight goes to visit him in the hospital, way, way far into the future. But these two met early on here in October of 1891, and these are the notes. Round 3, Starlight misses a big blow, and Creedon takes advantage. Heavy rights sending Starlight clean through the ropes. At the feet of the community, 2 more knockdowns, and Starlight was very groggy, but survives round 5. After a short rally, it ended with Creedon being floored. Creedon got up and then floored Starlight. And once more does it again as the fight looks near its end. So that's round 5, 3 knockdowns. 2 for Starlight, 1 for Creedon. Or 2 for Creedon, 1 for Starlight. Round 6, Starlight down twice more. 1 more minute had been, the round would have been done. Round 7, Starlight down for good. Professor William Miller announces Creedon and Costello coming up. This is Costello's second fight retirement to the very same man. This fight happens in the very 2 months later, December 1891. Buffalo Costello, number 1, 8-round win for Dan Creedon. Twice floored in the second round, Costello went down. The 6th round, Costello knocked around as Creedon punished him terribly. So it's an 8-round win for Dan Creedon. That's December 1891. The next match, March 1892. Buffalo Costello. A 23-round draw. Costello showing all of his old form finally. Costello took the first 9 rounds, then fatigued strongly. Costello down in round 9. Costello down multiple times as the contest goes on. A draw was declared. Creedon hurt his hand during the fight and could not finish off Costello. Creedon didn't expect Costello to train for the match, but he was in fair condition. Professor Miller indicates that he wanted a third contest, but it was declared off after a matter of months. So the official results, 23-round draw. This would be absolute win for Costello, or for Creedon, as he floored Costello multiple times throughout this match. So this is a very clear win for Costello. Sorry, for Creedon. I get the names confused. Next, we have May 1892. We have talk of Creedon versus Greggains, and talk of Creedon versus Jim Barge, who also was born right next to Dan Creedon. July 1892, middle of summer. Creedon never looked better as he sent Dunn through the ropes to a knockout punch. Creedon, who reportedly is as quick as a cat to take advantage of every legitimate opening offered. Finally, October of 92, he KOs Australian Jim Ryan. Jim Ryan down repeatedly. November of 1892, Creedon versus Charlie Dunn. Creedon's nose was bleeding badly at the end of round 1. Creedon staggered him but could not put him out. But Creedon won the match versus Charlie Dunn. Late November of 1892, Dan Creedon sails for America. Not that long after Bob Fitzsimmons had already left for America. Next, we have his first American match, as it takes a good 6 months for him to get his first name match. This features 25-year-old Dan Creedon versus 26-year-old Alex Greggains. The beginning, Greggains proved himself remarkably clever on his feet, avoiding the rushes of one Dan Creedon. In the 6th round, after a back-and-forth fighting, Greggains went down from a right hand. He managed to stagger to his feet and was saved by the call of time. Creedon was remarkably fresh as the rounds went on, as Creedon was in wonderful condition. The 13th round, time was called and Greggains was very, very groggy. Greggains' gameness won him considerable applause throughout the match. The 15th round, a left hand sent Greggains down like an ox, and he was unable to rise. Creedon was carried from the ring in jubilation by his seconds and fans. That is a very impressive debut in America for one Dan Creedon. I mean, I'd had to exceed his wildest expectations to get carried from the ring in like a movie scene to the locker room by fans and his seconds. I mean, what an incredible splash that he makes upon America upon arising. At this point, Creedon's stock was sky high. Shortly after this, he will spar with James Corbett, the beginning of the following month, and the pressure is completely put on Bob Fitzsimmons to defend his middleweight title. Does not take long. November 1893, Fitz signs to fight Dan Creedon. Afterwards, Greggains claims that Dan Creedon was a hard man to beat, and Creedon was hard to hit for Alex Greggains. As I stated, this is a common theme throughout the beginning of Creedon's career, being difficult to hit. So he has a somewhat of a very scientific approach. So this is the following year, January 1894, Creedon and Corbett spar at a benefit. And Corbett constantly is praising Creedon, talking him up, trying to get in the craw of Fitzsimmons, saying, you better fight this middleweight because I'm a heavyweight. So you better take on the middleweight. Which, of course, Fitz soon will. February 1894, we do a match with Dick Moore. The results of this match, 10-round draw. Creedon won this match, and it was a bad decision giving Moore the draw. Moore was dropped in the 5th round. So, of course, they do themselves a rematch because of this being a draw was a bad decision by the referee. April 1894, Dick Moore, number 2. Results, win, KO in number 9. And Creedon Moore, a favor, went to his very own hometown to fight him on his own turf. The men were even for the first few rounds. Very fast-paced fight. By the 6th round, both were bleeding. The 7th round, Creedon had a broke nose. Moore was down and bleeding nose and a left eye almost closed for Dick Moore. The 9th round, Moore, groggy and almost blinded, he fought bravely. An uppercut at close quarters, and he fell like a log and couldn't get up. The contrast demonstrated that although a plucky fighter who was Dick Moore and a very good delivery, he is no match for a tactician like one Dan Creedon. Creedon was taught very well in the Australian Academy and appears to be a ring tactician. Creedon, at this point, was in the circles of Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons being mentioned. It was also talked about a Jim Hall bout right around this time in the summer of 1894. Now that match should have very well happened, as Jim Hall was certainly one of the premier Australian fighters, and Creedon did nothing to prove he was better than Jim Hall. So it's one of my biggest regrets on the Creedon version of the Australian days is that he did not fight more of the Australian fighters. Tom Lees, Jim Hall, and Mick Dooley, all those three Creedon should have fought, and all three of them he managed to not fight. I guess he did fight Hall, but he didn't get a rematch. In June of 1894, Dan Creedon took on Frank Childs. Now, you would assume this would be a pretty even match, as both of these fighters had lots of power. But in fact, it was pretty non-competitive, as Childs had no ability to even really get a punch landed on Creedon, and he grew frustrated. And towards the end of the match, he kneeled on the ring floor to avoid punishment being delivered by Creedon, as he was booed and his corners threw in the sponge. The match was such a disaster that Creedon had to spar with his trainer at the time, Dick Moore, who he had just fought, and they sparred and gave the patrons a little bit of a show because the match was so disappointing. Just further proving that the Australians were much more of a tactician than the renegade American fighters such as Frank Childs. Childs certainly improved after this point, but this was not a very good exhibition on his part. At this point, the notoriety for Dan Creedon was sky high, and it set himself up for the big match that was coming. Finally, we got here. September 1894, the long-awaited super match for the middleweight championship of the world. Dan Creedon versus Bob Fitzsimmons. Creedon went down from a right-hander and he sprang up at the count of 9, but he was very groggy. Fitz knew Creedon was groggy, and he went down from a storm of blows as he was out for a minute or so. Results of the match: second round loss by KO to one Bob Fitzsimmons. So Fitzsimmons just kind of bum rushed him when he was groggy, and Creedon went down from a storm of blows. Now this happens September 1894. December 1894, just a matter of 2 months later, Fitzsimmons is in training to meet James Corbett. And at this point, Fitzsimmons kills one of his sparring partners in December of 1894, and eventually gets charged with manslaughter, as bringing Fitzsimmons' momentum of his career to a grinding halt, as unfortunately, both Creedon and Fitzsimmons skid a little bit towards the last of 1894 for different reasons. Next, we have May 1895, the following year. Joe Choynski, finally. The results of the match: 6-round draw. These are the notes. The fighters went back and forth with neither gaining an advantage. In the 5th round, A left to the head sent Creedon down. He was able to rise. The sixth round, Creedon was down again. Creedon rose once again and clinched repeatedly to close the round. A very weary man. Not sure how this was a draw, as Creedon's nose looked broken and he was bleeding profusely. I have this as a 6-round loss to Joe Choynski. As I stated in the notes, I'm not sure how this was a draw. Next, we have June of 1895. Creedon broke his left hand in the Hennessy fight. His left hand had a lump on it the size of a walnut on the knuckle. This forced Creedon to take the remainder of at least a large portion of the months off of 1895, as he's forced to heal his broken hand. Creedon is one of the fighters, along with Fitz, who has a little bit of a hand issues. And also, if you will recall by these notes here, Creedon almost repeatedly has nose bleeding issues. That's one of the things that's really costing him some of his stamina, as many of the matches Creedon has his nose bleeding early in the match, as he's got a rather large-sized nose, and it takes its fair share of abuse. October 1895, finally. Dan Creedon's big win. Frank Craig. It's an international bout for a vacant middleweight title. These are the notes. Creedon was down in the 6th round, and he survived a scare. The 12th round, the coffee cooler Frank Craig was spent, as he had no more energy, and he wore down as the fight went on, eventually losing a 20-round decision to one Dan Creedon. This was the longest bout that Frank Craig had in his career as far as rounds went, and he gave his most valiant effort to date, losing in 20 rounds to Dan Creedon. I believe this fight was in England, Great Britain, as Creedon went over into Frank Craig's own territory to fight him, much like he did with Dick Moore. He went to the other guy's home turf to fight him. Next, we have January 1896, 27-year-old Dan Creedon, as he's getting real near the cutoff of a prime, versus 33-year-old Jim Smith. The results of the match, KO in number 2. A solid first round. Creedon caught Smith in round 2, and he fell like a log. It was talked about many opponents at this time for Dan Creedon, as he had rebuilt his career prestige. It was talked about as opponents Tom Sharkey, Joe Choynski, Owen Sullivan, the Australian, and Kid Mccoy. So Sharkey would have definitely been too much for Dan Creedon. Owen Sullivan match would have been pretty darn good. Now finally we have 1896, as Creedon's hand is getting healed at this point, because he's almost 14 months past his hand breaking. And he's facing Henry Baker, a rising middleweight. It's a 20-round win. It was a tough fight in a match. Baker was shifty and hard to hit, but Creedon's blows lacked force. Creedon was bleeding badly from the nose as usual and struggled for wind throughout the match. Baker was just outclassed throughout the match, as Creedon said he did not train faithfully for this match. So this is the first indication to me that Creedon has started his drinking pattern as he's officially lost his stamina from youth because he's over the cutoff mark for prime of 27 years of age, and likely started drinking at this point because he's having stamina issues. And of course, from the very beginning, Creedon's nose was bleeding. I would have to imagine a broken nose, bleeding noses are a great factor contributing to the lack of stamina as you're forced to do mouth breathing. So next in Creedon's career, he signs to fight Dick O Brien, the tough middleweight, as they finally get themselves a match here. So we have the big, rough and tough scrapper Dick O Brien versus the scientific Dan Creedon. And we're going to see what happens as a result. December 1896, Dick O Brien. These are the notes. Creedon was seconded by the one and only Jim Mace for the fight. Creedon was far too scientific for the brawler Dick O Brien. At the end of the 8th round, both were very tired. And as the end seemed soon, the set was at a very fast pace. Boxing, and it was wearing on both fighters. Creedon was employing a two-fisted attack on Dick O Brien as he was having trouble slowing Creedon down, as he was relentlessly following him around the ring. O'Brien was staggered around the ring when the ref stopped it. The results of the match, 9-round win for Dan Creedon, TKO. So this had to be a huge match, as Dick O'Brien was a pretty top-notch competitor, at least a solid C-level opponent. As we can see, Dan Creedon is above the C level. Couple more notes coming up here. December 1896, heavy talk of Kid McCoy fight coming up. Now we're going into the following year, 1897. February 1897, a fake fight with Nick Burley. Burley was a substitute for Dick O'Brien rematch, and Burley was no condition to fight Creedon, as they went through the motions and were chastised for being a fake fight. August 1897, Dan Creedon signs to fight Kid McCoy for a whopping sum of $10,000. That's a very, very large purse, very large. September 1897, 3 rounds boxed with Choynski for a benefit. So this is pretty notable because September 1897, Choynski decides to start training Creedon, as Choynski aligns himself with Creedon for a period there. August 1897, Fitz predicts Creedon will win and get the better of the infighting against one Kid McCoy. November 1897, Creedon, pissed off that McCoy is fighting Mysterious Billy Smith, as he views he is the next fighter to fight him. The lead up to this in the paper is huge, as Choynski is training Dan Creedon for the bout with one Kid McCoy. That fight did not have much impact, as McCoy beats Mysterious Billy Smith, and the very next month, December of 1897, he does, as advertised, the bout with Dan Creedon. So this is the super bout for the middleweight championship. Dan Creedon versus Kid McCoy. These are the notes. The Kid was not a vicious slugger, but was vicious with short-armed, quick blows, almost certain to bring a knockout in the long run. In the fourth round, McCoy, very much quicker, forced Creedon to fight defensively. McCoy at long range proved too much for one Dan Creedon. The ninth round, a cut over the right eye was bleeding for Dan Creedon, as Creedon was having difficult seeing. In the 11th round, Creedon heavily blinded from blood. So the end is near for Creedon as the cut proves very costly for him. The 15th round, Creedon dropped in his own corner. He got up and is very groggy to his corner. Choynski throws in the sponge as we are between rounds. Result of the match, 15-round loss between rounds, as Creedon was bloody, spent, and had not much more stamina. McCoy, after this match of December of 1897, was talked about for the heavyweight crown against James Corbett. Creedon claims he was sick during the match. Shortly after this, Creedon referees a Bobby Dobbs match. Creedon signs to fight Tommy Ryan, but Tommy Ryan pulls out over the size of the purse as he wanted as much money to fight Dan Creedon as Kid McCoy got. And I stated that was a huge amount of money, $10,000. And they could not raise $10,000 for Creedon versus Tommy Ryan, which would have been a pretty good match, as Creedon is still enough in his prime that he would have gave him a good scrap. So here we are, September 1897, Jack Bonner. Dan Creedon is speculated that if he wins against Jack Bonner here, he will fight Tom Sharkey. The winner will fight Tom Sharkey. An uneventful fight. Bonner dropped Creedon and he fell so hard that he twisted his ankle and was not able to continue. The newspapers described this as a pitiful display by one Dan Creedon. Results of the match, 2 second-round loss, TKO. This really loses Creedon some prestige. And not only does he lose prestige, but Creedon, as he injures his ankle badly, is no longer able to train efficiently the following year in 1899. And starting the beginning and the end for Creedon is he starts developing real stamina problems because he couldn't keep himself in shape because of the twisted ankle in the Jack Bonner fight. Now, as I noted in simulation, Creedon beat Jack Bonner. And I think there's no doubt that Creedon was a better fighter than Jack Bonner, but Bonner got the best of him in that particular match. December 1898, 2 months later, I guess his ankle is still bothering him. 20-round loss to Green. Creedon was described as weak and listless. Certainly not how you want to be described as a fighter. Weak and listless. February 1899, Creedon's bad ankle, and he can't get in shape for the Tommy Ryan fight. Again, delaying the match with Tommy Ryan, and at this point, it's never going to happen. April 1899. This is a very good match as we get 2 very evenly matched fighters. Dan Creedon versus one Tommy West. These are the notes. A 4th round West uppercut Creedon, and Creedon's nose began to bleed. As I stated, Creedon's nose bleeds pretty often. The 6th round, Creedon was cut over the eye and bled freely. A back and forth fight. No knockdowns occurred. Charlie White declares the match a draw. 20-round draw. We don't really know who would have won that. I guess a draw is a pretty good outcome, but Creedon was certainly bleeding badly. Just barely in good enough shape to go 20 rounds. Next, we have one of his level-ups. April 1899, just a matter of a couple weeks after Tommy Ryan. Joe Walcott, number 1. The results of the match: first round loss KO, as Joe Walcott came out and steamrolled Dan Creedon with 3 knockdowns. Not a very good showing for one Dan Creedon. But Creedon had no fear of Walcott as they booked themselves a rematch, June 1899. Joe Walcott, number 2. Results of the match: 20-round loss. And guess who Dan Creedon has in his corner for this fight? None other than Kid Levine, George Levine. As I stated, born right in the time frame of Dan Creedon, and Kid Levine is in the corner for Dan Creedon versus Joe Walcott, number 2. These are the notes. A very close match. Creedon blows still lack force. A back-and-forth match with Walcott the aggressor. No knockdowns. Creedon took enough punishment to knock out half a dozen normal boxers. Results of the match: 20-round loss to Joe Walcott, number 2. August 1899, Creedon beats Fred Morris, another black fighter, by TKO, again described as having no steam in his blows. As I stated, Creedon just lost his muscle tone. His body started deteriorating rapidly. October 1899, a Reedy match. He fights a fighter named Reedy. The Creedon is described as being fat and slow and out of shape. November 1899, Creedon loses again to Walcott as they face the 3rd match. Creedon painfully slow in his movements and a bad judge of distance. Very badly. Today, the Australian is a mere burlesque squick of his former self, as he no longer has any punch in his steams and lacks conditioning. Obviously, the drinking was starting to impact Dan Creedon at this point. May 1900, Kid Mccoy, number 2. Very non-competitive match. The 3rd round, Creedon down from a left hand hook that brought blood. The 4th round, Creedon very tired and bleeding badly. The 5th round, Creedon barely on his feet as he goes to his corner. The 6th round, Creedon down from a left and a right, and his corner throws in the sponge. Results of the match: 6th round loss, TKO, Kid Mccoy, number 2. Next, we have another level up, October 1900. Jack Root, 1st round loss via KO, as Creedon just steamrolled by one Jack Root. He's in no shape to fight him. May 1901, Marvin Hart. Results of the match: 6th round loss, KO. Creedon down in round 5 and knocked through the ropes in round 6 as he loses from KO. April 1902, young Peter Jackson, 5-round loss via TKO as Creedon quit from body blows received during the match, as he states that he felt sick and nauseous and about to throw up from the body blows administered by one young Peter Jackson. May 1902, Creedon was in no shape for his fight against Dick O Brien and loses. Second round loss TKO is Creedon just completely spent in his career. Finally, we have the last bit of redemption for one Dan Creedon. November 1902, Bill Doherty. This is the new school versus the old school. Doherty was from the class of 1895 in Australia. Creedon was from the class of 1889, 1890. Creedon was bleeding in round 2, but rattled Doherty in the second round. A hook dropped Doherty, but Creedon was always on top of him and not able to finish him at this point. Creedon was as cool as a proverbial cucumber. The round 3, Doherty seemed in the lead now. Round 4 started like a hurricane, both men mixing it up very lively. The 5th round, Creedon seemed to punch Bill on the ribs, then Bill pulled away, and the latter stood for a moment, and then, to the astonishment of the audience, went down from the body blow. With the question, where did Dan Creedon hit him? So apparently that was a delayed reaction in the knockout, as Creedon hit him with a body blow, and Doherty pulled away from the punch and then went down from pain and was counted out. The results of the match: 5-round win over Bill Doherty, as Creedon is declared the South African champion at this point, as they're fighting in South Africa, which was one of the boxing hotbeds where Owen Sullivan was fighting out of. Joe Goddard also fought in South Africa, but Creedon returns and is the champion once again, as he gets himself a victory over Bill Doherty. He does defend his title for a few times against some Class D opponents, and he eventually retires. His retirement age is real old. Let me see here. His retirement age in 1911 at the age of 43, as he kind of lingered on for just a little bit there, but really the end of his run was right after he, shortly after he beat Bill Doherty in middleweight championship. So, as we can see from Creedon's career, multiple times he was a middleweight champion. He did manage to beat the intercontinental match with Frank Craig, the Australian versus the Briton, and he was successful in that. Overall, Creedon had no luck in doing any of his level ups, but any of the guys that were right in the class of the Class B fighters, Creedon was very competitive against. Creedon had very difficult time facing taller fighters, as he really needed at least a little bit of a reach advantage. And, of course, Creedon had no ability to be able to knock these fighters out, as he lost his steam in the second half of his career there, and really costing him some of his power. Creedon states, of course, that the drinking was part of his problem, and he states in the newspapers that the only match that he was really in good shape for at the end of his career was the Bill Doherty match, the match that he wins. As he stated, he was in good shape for that match. The match was somewhat controversial, as the audience did not see the blow that put Doherty down, and there was speculation perhaps that even Doherty threw the match, but most of that was done through the rumor mill, more of the newspaper they didn't feel that the match was a fake match, but it was circulated that perhaps it could have been. So overall, Dan Creedon, pretty uneven boxer, but Creedon holds the one true thing as he came out of the gate red hot, and he stayed red hot for quite a while throughout his career. And he even gave a Kid McCoy and Joe Walcott, two very long, tough, grueling matches, 15 rounds with McCoy and 20 rounds with Joe Walcott. He could not win from either one of them, but the fact that he could last that long against those fighters above him certainly shows the real true potential of a Dan Creedon that's in shape and has his power restored. So Dan Creedon, number 41 on the countdown of the great Era 1 fighters. So Creedon died July 10th, 1942, at the age of 74, as he completely outlived many of these folks who had died in the 30s. He lived a pretty long age, and 74 years old is pretty deep into the next decade for someone born in 1868. So that is the story of Dan Creedon. Thanks for listening. Give a thumbs up and please subscribe. Thanks.